I wanted to go through an article by Bertrand Russell. Now, you're going to be reading something by Bertrand Russell entitled, Why I'm Not a Christian. So no one can suspect me here of sneaking in somebody that's really sympathetic to religion or to Christianity, and so that's why he's saying these things. Bertrand Russell hated Christianity. I'm passing out one article. There's a whole book of articles by Russell entitled, taking the title from that, Why I'm Not a Christian. He has whether religion has made positive contributions to civilization, and on and on and on. He hated religion, and he hated Christianity in particular. And so, in his book, The Problems of Philosophy, published in 1967, Russell has a chapter entitled On Induction. Now, you all know what induction is. It's this principle that our experience in the past is a reliable guide to how things will happen in the future. And in the article, he goes through various ways you could rationally, or not in terms of the school of rationalism, but how you could intellectually justify the principle of induction. And I just want you to hear his conclusion. He says the inductive principle is incapable of being proved by an appeal to experience. Somebody says, oh, I know why the sun will rise tomorrow. I know why the eggs will fry. I know why. And you'll say, why? Well, because I've experienced it. And Russell is saying you cannot prove the inductive principle by appealing to experience. Experience, I'm now reading again, experience might conceivably confirm the inductive principle as regards the cases that have been already examined. Okay, all those past experiences might be confirmed by experience. But as regards unexamined cases, future cases, or it doesn't even have to be future. If eggs fry on a hot griddle in America, do they do that in China too? You say, well, we assume that they do. He says, yeah, but you haven't examined those cases. But as regards unexamined cases, it is the inductive principle alone that can justify any inference from what has been examined to what has not been examined. It's a crucial sentence. And it's also what puts the noose right around his unbelieving neck. Because he says, if you appeal to experience to prove eggs fry in China or eggs will fry next Tuesday, he says you're assuming the inductive principle. And so experience does not justify the inductive principle. It's the inductive principle that allows you to use experience and draw conclusions about unexamined cases. All arguments which on the basis of experience argue as to the future or the unexperienced parts of the past or present assume the inductive principle. Hence, we can never use experience to prove the inductive principle without begging the question. Bertrand Russell, expert in 20th century logic, says if we use the inductive principle, we're begging the question, which is the logical fallacy. Thus, we must either accept the inductive principle on the ground of its intrinsic evidence or forego all justification of our expectations about the future. He says there's two options. Of course, being an unbeliever, he's excluding the third option, which is we know that nature is uniform because God, the personal God, who created the heavens and the earth and sovereignly controls everything that happens right down to the hairs of our head, that God makes the future like the past and amenable to our knowledge so that we can get to know it, subdue it to His glory. But Russell says, no, it's either the intrinsic evidence for it or there is no justification whatsoever. Well, if there's no justification, that is to say, believing in the inductive principle is irrational or arbitrary. Remember that? Here's a man talking about the most basic principle of science. And he says, we're going to be rational. Here's a man who hates the living and true God, is going to give you all kinds of arguments against this. And he says, but when all's said and done, that principle that is the foundation for all of our reasoning is arbitrary. He begins with an irrational starting point, and from that point on says, I'm going to strictly be rational. He says, or we have to accept it on its intrinsic evidence. By the way, this is cute, especially for somebody who was as technically proficient as Bertrand Russell was in philosophy. Intrinsic evidence is just a real slimy euphemistic way of saying what is accepted on its own evidence. Self-evidently. It's intrinsic evidence. And so he says, the general principles of science, such as the belief in the reign of law and the belief that every event must have a cause, are as completely dependent upon the inductive principle as are the beliefs of daily life. All such general principles are believed because mankind has found innumerable instances of their truth and no instances of their falsehood. But this affords no evidence for their truth in the future unless the inductive principle is assumed. So what we have here is the unbeliever himself giving us all the evidence we need that only the Christian worldview provides the preconditions of intelligibility for science, for reasoning, for language. It is the most reasonable thing in the world to believe in God. It is entirely unreasonable not to believe in God. And why is that? Because God's existence is the precondition for all reasoning. I'm going to read that again. In fact, I wouldn't mind using my last 3 minutes just to read it over and over again. I want this to sink in. Now, I set all of this up by talking to you about proof theory, about how subjective considerations are irrelevant, and on and on and on. I am simply talking about objective matters pertaining to intelligibility or reason. And how I've proved God's existence now is by showing that it's entirely unreasonable not to believe in God, which is to say it's entirely reasonable to believe in God, because God's existence is the precondition for all reasoning. Anytime the unbeliever wants to reason with you, he's lost. Later in the week you may ask me about this. Okay, what about people who finally get the point? No laws of logic on the non-Christian worldview. No inductive principle on the non-Christian worldview. No moral absolutes on the non-Christian worldview. No dignity for man on the non-Christian worldview. No freedom of the mind on the non-Christian worldview. All of which are assumed in the reasoning or arguing or debating process. And so the unbeliever says, well then, fine. I won't believe in God, and so I just won't reason or debate with you. Well, if you want to know the apologetical answer, it is, okay, fine. Well, then you concede that we're right and you're wrong. Because, you see, the fact that you won't cry uncle doesn't mean that I don't have you in a hammerlock. Remember what I said? Proof and persuasion are two different things. And your job is not to make him cry uncle. It'd be wonderful if he did, but believe me, if he does, it won't be because your arguments are so sterling, it's because the Holy Spirit's so strong. You shut his mouth, the Holy Spirit, by God's grace, will open his heart. So I'm not claiming that a profession of God's existence is necessary to engage in reasoning. I'm rather claiming that the atheistic worldview cannot provide a cogent reason for what we necessarily assume in all reasoning. That is, atheism cannot make sense out of our reasoning and must be dismissed as just another version of intellectual arbitrariness. Atheists are living by habitual conditioning. They are living by, on their worldview, blind faith regarding the rationality of the universe.